The folded note passed between them so quickly that no one in the crowded VIP lounge noticed. A small square of paper pressed into Seo Min-ho's palm as Lindy Jameson brushed past him with a tray of champagne glasses, her voice barely a breath above silence, timed perfectly against the swell of laughter rising from a nearby table. "Don't drink it," she whispered. "Ask him to go first. Trust me." Min-ho's fingers closed around the paper on instinct alone, his expression giving nothing away, the same practiced stillness that had carried him through a decade of high-stakes negotiations, though something cold and sharp settled instantly in his chest. He did not know this woman. He had hired her exactly 9 days ago to plan tonight's event, a recommendation from a colleague who had praised her work without a single reservation, her portfolio impressive enough that he had approved her without even requesting a formal interview. And now, in the middle of one of the most important business dinners of his year, surrounded by investors he had spent months courting, she had just handed him a warning that made his pulse quicken in a way very few things manage to do anymore. He glanced down briefly at the paper still folded against his palm, resisting the urge to open it immediately in front of the room, every instinct honed by years of careful public composure, warning him to wait. To understand exactly how a stranger's whispered warning ended up folded in a billionaire's hand, we have to rewind 20 minutes, back to a mirror on the far wall of that same lounge. Lindy had been adjusting the floral centerpiece near the private booth reserved for Min-ho and his closest business associates when she caught the reflection in the ornate gold-framed mirror hanging above the bar. It was such a small thing at first, barely worth a second glance, a man's hand moving with practiced ease over a drink that wasn't his own. The lounge around her buzzed with the low hum of expensive conversation, glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling in waves that had nothing to do with what she had just seen. She recognized him instantly. Jung Tae-jin, Min-ho's business partner of 8 years, a fixture at every one of the tycoon's public appearances, always photographed a respectful half-step behind him, always smiling in a way that never quite reached his eyes. She watched, frozen, as he tipped something clear and colorless from a small vial into a crystal glass, stirring it briefly before signaling to a server to have it presented in the honorary cup reserved for the guest of the evening. Her stomach turned to ice. The centerpiece in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, her fingers going numb around the stems as her mind scrambled to process what her eyes had just confirmed. She told herself she was mistaken. She told herself powerful men did not poison each other in rooms full of witnesses, not men who had built empires together over 8 years of partnership, not in a lounge filled with cameras and staff and dozens of watchful eyes. But she had learned long ago, in a career built on reading rooms other people never bothered to study, arranging seating charts around egos and rivalries most guests never noticed, that the wealthy were far better than anyone gave them credit for, at hiding exactly this kind of thing in plain sight. Her hands trembled slightly as she finished arranging the flowers, forcing her expression into practiced neutrality, even as her mind raced through every possible outcome. Her training as an event planner, the years spent learning to keep a calm face, no matter what chaos unfolded behind the scenes, suddenly proving useful in a way she never could have anticipated. If she said nothing and she was right, a man could die tonight in a room she had spent 3 weeks planning to perfection, every detail agonized over, every seating arrangement carefully considered. If she spoke up and she was wrong, she would likely never work in this industry again, her reputation destroyed by a single reckless accusation against one of Seoul's most respected businessmen, her years of careful, painstaking work erased overnight by one moment of misjudgment. She thought, briefly, of every door that had already closed on her simply because of how she looked. Every contract handed instead to someone with half her experience and none of her eye for detail. Every polite rejection letter that never quite explained why the position had gone to someone else. She thought of how differently Min-ho had treated her from the very first meeting, paying her full rate without negotiation, listening to her ideas without the subtle condescension she had grown so used to swallowing in silence, the small daily indignities she had learned to absorb without complaint, simply to keep working. He had trusted her with something that mattered to him, had looked at her portfolio and seen only skill, nothing else. She was not going to repay that trust with silence now, not when it might cost him his life. She made her decision before her fear could talk her out of it. Weaving through the crowd with a tray of champagne as cover, she found her opening as Min-ho stepped briefly away from his table, and she pressed the note into his palm, along with her whispered warning, disappearing back into the crowd before he could even fully register what had happened. Min-ho returned to his seat with the folded note still pressed against his palm, his mind working through the impossible calculation now in front of him. Trust a stranger he had known for 9 days, or trust the business partner who had stood beside him through 8 years of deals, disasters, and celebrations, through the launch of 3 companies and the collapse of one marriage he barely survived. Every instinct honed by decades of boardroom warfare told him the note was likely nothing, a misunderstanding, an overreaction from someone unfamiliar with how these rooms actually worked. He glanced at Tae-jin across the table, who was raising the honorary cup toward him with a warm, practiced smile, already gesturing for Min-ho to take his own. The gesture was so familiar, so exactly like 100 other toasts they had shared over the years, that for a moment, Min-ho nearly dismissed the note entirely as paranoia dressed up as concern. "To 8 incredible years," Tae-jin said, his voice smooth and easy, carrying easily over the low hum of surrounding conversation. "And to many more ahead." Min-ho lifted his glass slowly, watching his partner's face with a scrutiny he had never before thought necessary, studying the small details he had spent 8 years training himself not to notice out of simple courtesy. There was something in the way Tae-jin's smile held a fraction too long, something in the slight impatience flickering behind his eyes, as Min-ho hesitated, swirling the drink instead of lifting it to his lips, buying himself precious seconds to decide. "You seem eager for me to drink," Min-ho said lightly, testing the water, watching for any crack in the composure across from him. "Only eager to celebrate properly," Tae-jin said, though something in his tone had shifted, a note of strain creeping in beneath the practiced warmth, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to a man who had spent a lifetime reading the smallest tells in a negotiation. Min-ho set his glass down deliberately and slid it across the table, replacing it with Tae-jin's own untouched cup. "Then let's celebrate together, you first." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it told Min-ho everything he needed to know. Tae-jin's smile faltered, his hand freezing halfway toward the glass now in front of him, his composure cracking just enough for the truth to show through. A flash of naked panic crossing a face that had spent years perfecting itself into unreadable calm. "There's no need to make this strange," Tae-jin said, forcing a laugh that landed hollow in the sudden quiet between them. "Drink your own glass, Min-ho." "Drink this one," Min-ho said, his voice dropping into something far colder than before. "Or explain to me why you won't." Tae-jin's eyes darted briefly toward the exit, a flicker of panic breaking through 8 years of carefully maintained composure. Min-ho did not wait for an answer. He lifted his phone beneath the table and sent a single message to his head of security, requesting immediate access to the lounge's surveillance feed for the past 30 minutes. His hands steady, even as something cold and furious began building beneath his controlled exterior. The tension between them stretched taut as violin strings while they waited, both men seated in silence, the celebration around them continuing obliviously, while an entirely different confrontation played out at their table, invisible to everyone except the 2 men who understood exactly what was happening. Min-ho kept his eyes fixed on Tae-jin's face, cataloging every flicker of movement, every bead of sweat gathering faintly at his hairline, despite the lounge's carefully controlled temperature. Tae-jin, for his part, seemed to be running through his own calculations, glancing periodically toward the exits, his fingers drumming an anxious, irregular rhythm against the tablecloth. Somewhere behind them, out of sight, in a small back office, Min-ho's security team worked quickly through the surveillance archive, cross-referencing timestamps, isolating the exact angle that would leave no room for doubt. Every minute that passed felt to Min-ho like an hour, his mind cycling back through 8 years of memories, searching for some earlier sign he might have missed, some warning he had failed to read in all that time. Quick stop Afro-Korean Vibes community, kindly like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to know where you are watching from, kindly drop it in the comment. Min-ho's head of security arrived within minutes, tablet in hand, his expression grim as he leaned down to speak quietly near his employer's ear. The footage had already been pulled, clear and undeniable, time-stamped and impossible to dispute. Young Tae-jin, captured from 3 separate angles, tipping the contents of a small vial into Min-ho's intended drink before instructing a server to present it in the honorary cup, his movements calm and unhurried, a man entirely confident he would never be caught. Min-ho studied the footage on the tablet in silence, his jaw tightening with every passing second, the full weight of 8 years of trust collapsing in real time as he watched his closest business partner betray him with the same steady hands that had shaken his own after every successful deal. "Explain this," he said finally, turning the tablet to face Tae-jin directly, the recorded image of his own hand frozen mid-pour, displayed clearly on the screen for anyone nearby to see. Tae-jin's face drained of color entirely. Around the table, a few nearby guests had begun to notice the shift in atmosphere, conversations faltering as attention slowly turned toward the two men, sensing that something significant was unfolding beneath the polished surface of the evening. "I can explain," Tae-jin said, his voice cracking, all pretense of composure abandoned now. "It wasn't meant to kill you, just enough to make you sick, to embarrass you in front of the investors tonight, to remind the board why they should consider new leadership. I never wanted this to go further than that, I swear it." "You wanted me humiliated," Min-ho said quietly, "or dead, depending on how much you actually measured into that glass. 8 years, Tae-jin. 8 years of partnership, of dinners at my mother's table, of standing beside me at every milestone, and this is what you decided I deserved." "You always had everything," Tae-jin spat, his composure finally shattering completely, years of buried resentment spilling out at once, his voice rising loud enough now that nearby guests could no longer pretend not to hear. "The recognition, the board's confidence, every major deal handed to you first while I stood beside you, always second, always overlooked, always the name people forgot the moment they walked out of the room. I built half of what you take credit for, and no one ever remembered my name in the headlines." Several guests near the edge of the lounge had gone completely silent now, phones lowered, drinks forgotten in their hands, watching the unraveling of a partnership that had, until minutes ago, seemed as solid as the marble floor beneath them. "If that were true," Min-ho said, his voice like ice now, utterly unmoved by the outburst, "you would have said so 8 years ago, in a boardroom, like a man with any remaining dignity. Instead you chose poison, in a room full of witnesses, on a night meant to celebrate everything we built together." Security officers, already summoned and stationed discreetly near the lounge entrance in anticipation of exactly this outcome, moved in swiftly and efficiently. Tae-jin's protests dissolved into desperate, incoherent justifications as he was escorted from the room in full view of the stunned crowd, his reputation and partnership ending in the same devastating instant. 8 years of carefully constructed alliance dismantled in under 3 minutes. It was only as the commotion settled and the room slowly returned to its uneasy murmur that Lindy, watching from near the bar where she had positioned herself the entire time, felt a jolt of recognition move through her. She had seen that face before, months ago, seated at the head of a review board in Busan, waving off her portfolio with barely a glance, while awarding the summit's event planning contract to his own underqualified relative instead. Someone who had never once managed an event of that scale. The same man who had dismissed her competence without a second thought, who had looked at her credentials and decided she wasn't worth the risk, was now being led away in disgrace, undone in part by the very instincts he had never once considered valuable enough to hire. Min-ho found her 20 minutes later, once the lounge had quieted and the last of the stunned guests had been reassured and sent home. She was gathering her equipment near the now-abandoned floral displays, her hands still faintly trembling from the adrenaline of the evening, moving through the motions of packing away centerpieces and table settings, simply because it gave her something familiar to focus on. "You saved my life tonight," he said, stopping a respectful distance away, his voice quieter now than it had been all evening. "My own security team, the people I pay handsomely to notice exactly this kind of threat, missed everything. You caught it from across the room while arranging flowers." "I wasn't looking for trouble," Lindy said honestly, setting down a vase and finally allowing herself to meet his eyes directly. "I just happened to see something in the mirror I couldn't unsee." "Most people would have said nothing," Min-ho said. "The risk to you, if you'd been wrong, would have been enormous. You could have lost everything over a misunderstanding. The risk to you, if I'd stayed silent and I was right, would have been worse," she said simply. "I've spent a long time in rooms where nobody wanted to hear what I noticed. Tonight I decided it mattered more to speak than to stay comfortable." Something in his expression shifted, an assessment he seemed to be recalculating entirely, studying her now the way he studied contracts, searching for exactly what kind of value stood in front of him. "You'll be paid 5 times your original rate for tonight," he said. "That's not negotiable, but I'd also like to offer you something more significant, if you're willing to hear it." "I'm listening." "The Seoul and Miami Business Summit," he said. 10 times the scale of the Busan event you were passed over for. I intend to personally recommend you as lead planner, your name, front and center, on a stage large enough that no board anywhere will ever again be able to pretend they don't know who you are. Lindy felt something tighten in her throat, years of being overlooked and undervalued colliding suddenly with a moment she had never quite allowed herself to imagine, even in her most hopeful daydreams, during long nights spent building a portfolio, nobody seemed willing to fully see. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you did something for me tonight that no one else in this building was willing or able to do," Min-ho said, his voice steady and certain. "I don't reward people out of pity, Miss Jameson. I reward competence and courage when I finally see it clearly. Tonight, I saw both, and I'm not in the habit of letting talent like that walk out of a room unnoticed twice." In the weeks that followed, news of Jung Tae-jin's arrest and the collapse of his standing spread quickly through Seoul's business circles, his name quietly erased from boardrooms he had once dominated, his relative's contract for the Busan summit quietly reviewed and reassigned once questions began surfacing about how it had been awarded in the first place. Lindy's own name, meanwhile, began appearing in conversations she had once only dreamed of being part of. Her reputation transformed overnight from an overlooked planner fighting for scraps of recognition into one of the most sought-after names in the industry, her phone ringing with opportunities she would have once been told, politely but firmly, that she wasn't quite right for. She and Min-ho continued to work closely together in the months that followed, a genuine friendship forming from the ashes of that one dangerous evening, built on something far sturdier than gratitude alone. He trusted her judgment in rooms where he trusted almost no one else's, often seeking her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with event planning at all. She, in turn, found in him something rare, a powerful man who valued what she brought to a table, rather than merely tolerating her presence at it, who had proven in the space of a single terrifying evening that he was exactly the person she had risked everything to protect. Occasionally, over coffee before a meeting, or during a quiet moment backstage at some new event, one of them would bring up that night again, not out of morbid fascination, but out of something closer to reverence for how easily everything could have gone differently. Min-ho once admitted to her that he had replayed the moment of switching the glasses more times than he could count, wondering what might have happened had he simply trusted 8 years of habit over a stranger's whispered warning. Lindy never had an answer for that beyond the simple truth she had already given him once before. Some things you just cannot unsee. In the end, the world often measures people by titles, by connections, by the length of time someone has stood beside you smiling. But integrity rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up quietly, in a whispered warning passed across a crowded room by someone with everything to lose and nothing obvious to gain. in a decision made in the space of a few frightened heartbeats by someone who could have simply looked away. Sometimes the person willing to risk everything for a stranger's safety is the very one the world has spent years teaching to stay silent, to shrink, to doubt her own eyes. And that, more than any title or fortune passed down through years of careful maneuvering, is the truest measure of worth a person can carry. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more amazing Afro-Korean drama stories, and we'll see you in the next one.